The silence was a manufactured thing, a perfect, sterile void pressed into the space between his breaths. It was the sound of Athelgard's precision, the hum of atmospheric regulators, and the distant, imagined chime of orbital mechanics. Elien stood on the dais, a statue carved from compliance, his skin chilled by the recycled air. The silk of his tunic, the color of cream and surrender, was a whisper against his skin, its texture a known and catalogued sensation. He was a gift. The thought was not his own. It was a line of code inscribed upon his psyche, a fundamental truth of his existence. He had been cultivated for this moment, pruned and polished like a bonsai tree in the administrator's sterile gardens, every impulse contrary to placid beauty snipped away before it could bloom. His scent was a carefully constructed whisper of winter jasmine and rain on cold stone, muted by the subcutaneous suppressor patch just below his jaw. Controlled, contained, perfect. The great blast doors at the far end of the presentation chamber hissed, a serpent's breath of depressurization that broke the sanctified quiet. Light, raw and unfiltered, sliced into the dim, liturgical twilight of the room. It was not the soft, ambient glow of Ethelgard, but the harsh, golden glare of a star, unfiltered by atmospheric particulates. It was the light of a conqueror. Elien did not flinch. His training was a steel chassis around his nerves. His gaze remained fixed on the geometric patterns inlaid in the floor 5 paces before him, his posture an equation of submission. He was an Omega, a peace offering to the Alpha, who had shattered their fleets and brought their celestial city-state to its knees. He was the final, desperate gambit of a civilization that valued form over function, a piece of art intended to placate a beast. Footsteps followed the light. They were heavy, unhurried, the sound of worn leather on polished chrome, the sound of a man who had never learned to walk silently because he had never needed to. With each step, a scent preceded him, cutting through the chamber's sterile neutrality. It was not a cologne or a manufactured pheromone blend. It was elemental, pine and smoke, the sharp tang of ozone after a lightning strike, and the cold, unyielding scent of forged iron. It was the scent of the Vargan hegemony, of worlds with actual weather and dirt and seasons. It was the scent of the Alpha, Kalen. It filled the space, a tangible pressure that pushed against Elien's carefully constructed calm, seeking purchase, seeking reaction. He felt the suppressor patch on his neck grow warm, working overtime to neutralize the frantic spike of his own pheromones. Fear, raw and instinctual, tried to coil in his gut, but the conditioning was stronger. It smothered the feeling, replacing it with a hollow echo of programmed response. Be still. Be pleasing. Be nothing. The footsteps stopped. The Alpha stood before him, a silhouette against the blinding doorway. Elien did not look up. He had been instructed on the precise angle of his gaze, the gentle curve of his neck, a display of vulnerability, an invitation. The silence stretched, no longer sterile, but fraught with a new predatory quality. Elien could feel the weight of the Alpha's scrutiny, a physical sensation like a hand hovering just above his skin. He catalogued the sounds, the soft rustle of a heavy cloak, the quiet click of a buckle, the impossibly loud rhythm of his own heart. He was an object being appraised, a vase, a jewel, a spoil of war. He waited for the touch, the claiming scent mark, the rough hand that would signify the transfer of ownership. He had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 simulations, his body programmed to yield without hesitation, but the touch never came. Instead, a voice, low and rough like gravel, vibrated through the air. "This is it. This is the great offering of the Ethelgard Compact." The words were not laced with lust or triumph. They were flat, edged with something that sounded unnervingly like disappointment, or perhaps disgust. A current of confusion, sharp and unwelcome, jolted through Elian's placid surface. This was not in the simulations. The Alpha was supposed to be overwhelmed by his beauty, by the symbolic power of his surrender. He was supposed to be a prize. "It is designated Unit 734 Lord Alpha," another voice said, thin and obsequious. "Administrator Vorlag, his creator, his warden. The finest Omega of his generation, genetically perfected for compatibility and temperament. He is yours, a symbol of our desire for lasting peace." The Alpha Kalen made a sound, a short, sharp exhalation that was not a laugh. A symbol. He moved, his shadow falling over Elian. Elian fought the instinct to recoil. He could smell the heat coming off the man's body, the faint scent of sweat and leather, and the lingering chill of the void. "You shatter your own laws of sentient rights, offering a person as chattel, and you call it a symbol of peace." Elian's mind snagged on the word. Person. It was a clinical, legal term in Ethelgard, one that had been carefully defined to exclude him. He was an asset. He was a biological artifact. He was not a person. "He is an Omega, Lord Alpha," Vorlag corrected smoothly. "Bred for purpose. He understands his function." Kalen was silent for a long moment. Elian could feel the intensity of his gaze finally lift from the floor and settle on his face. He resisted the urge to meet it. Do not make eye contact until invited. Do not show agency. The rules were a litany, a prayer against the sin of selfhood. Then a gloved finger, cool through the leather, touched the suppressor patch on his neck. It wasn't a caress. It was an inspection, clinical, detached. Elian's breath hitched, a tiny, unforgivable sound in the vast chamber. "His scent is almost non-existent," Kalen murmured, his voice closer now. "You've throttled him." "Why?" "For purity, Lord Alpha. To prevent any emotional contamination. He presents a blank slate for you to imprint upon." "A blank slate," Kalen repeated, and this time the irony in his tone was sharp enough to draw blood. He withdrew his hand. "I have no use for blank slates or for pets. I have use for soldiers, for strategists, for people who can think for themselves. Your lasting peace is built on a foundation of weakness I find insulting." He turned, his cloak sweeping the air. The scent of pine and iron swirled, potent and unsettling. Elian's world, a carefully balanced structure of expectation and response, began to tilt on its axis. This was wrong, all wrong. The conqueror was supposed to take the prize. He was not supposed to find it wanting. He was not supposed to walk away. "Take it to my quarters," Kalen commanded, his voice echoing in the sudden emptiness. He did not look back. "I'll decide what to do with it later." It. The word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile illusion of being a precious gift and leaving only the cold, hard reality of being an object, an inconvenient, unwanted object. And for the first time in his life, beneath the layers of conditioning and chemical suppression, Elian felt a flicker of something utterly his own. The cold, sharp sting of humiliation. Kalen strode through the corridors of the conquered orbital station, the polished chrome floors reflecting his grim visage like a series of fractured mirrors. His boots, practical and worn, were an affront to the station's pristine aesthetic, and he relished the discord. The Ethelgard Compact had fallen not with a bang, but with a whimper, its legendary fleet a parade of elegant, ineffective ships, its strategists more concerned with the philosophical implications of surrender than the practicalities of a defense. He had expected a fight worthy of his Vargan warriors. Instead, he had been met with capitulation and this, a ceremony, a presentation, a living trophy. The memory of the Omega on the dais was a bitter taste in his mouth. The boy, for he was little more than a boy, was a perfect, chilling embodiment of everything Kalen despised about this culture, a beautiful, hollow shell, engineered for submission. His second in command, Lena, a stern woman with a jagged scar bisecting her left eyebrow, fell into step beside him. Her scent was practical, like his own, clean steel and the dry dust of the Vargan homeworld. "Lord Alpha," she said, her voice low, "the council is assembled. They are eager for your report on the finalization of the treaty." "The treaty is a formality," Kalen grunted, not breaking his stride. "They have no leverage. They'll sign whatever we put in front of them." "And the gift?" Lena asked, the slight hesitation in her voice betraying her distaste. The Vargan people did not deal in sentient currency. Strength was earned, status was won in combat or council, not presented on a silk cushion. To them, the offering was a profound dishonor, both to the giver and the receiver. "It's in my quarters," Kalen said, the words clipped. Lena was silent for a few paces. "The men are talking. They see it as a sign of Ethelgard's rot. Some are concerned that rot might be contagious." "Let them talk," Kalen said, turning a sharp corner into a less ostentatious section of the station, the part he had claimed for his command. The walls here were utilitarian grey, stripped of the holographic art and gilded filigree. "The Omega is a problem, not a temptation." He stopped before the door to his quarters, placing his palm on the scanner. The lock chimed its compliance. "The problem is what it represents. They believe this is an honorable offering. They believe we can be pacified by decadence, that our base instincts can be soothed by a pretty toy. They fundamentally misunderstand us." "What will you do with him?" Lena pressed, her gaze unwavering. Kalen looked at the closed door. He could feel the presence of the Omega on the other side, a pocket of manufactured stillness in the bustling warship that the station had become. "I don't know," he admitted, the words grating. He was a man of action, of decisive victories and clear objectives. Indecision was a foreign country. Sending him back would be seen as a gesture of contempt and might incite the very instability we came here to quell. Accepting him in the traditional sense. He shook his head, a grimace twisting his lips. "It would validate their entire corrupt system. It would make me a hypocrite." He entered his quarters, letting the door slide shut behind him, leaving Lena outside in the corridor. The rooms were Spartan, stripped of all but the most essential furnishings: a cot, a desk cluttered with data slates, a weapons maintenance bench, and in the center of the main living space, standing exactly where the guards had left him, was the Omega. He hadn't moved. His hands were clasped loosely before him, his gaze fixed on the floor. He was a piece of living statuary, so perfectly still he barely seemed to breathe. The air still carried the cloying, artificial scent of the presentation chamber, a ghost of jasmine trying to survive in a room that smelled of gun oil and recycled oxygen. Kalen walked to his desk and began unbuckling the heavy weapon belt he wore, laying it down with a solid, metallic thud. The Omega flinched, a microscopic tremor that rippled through his shoulders. It was the first sign of genuine, uncontrolled life Kalen had seen from him, and it was perversely satisfying. He watched the boy in the reflection of the darkened monitor screen. He saw the tension in the line of his neck, the rigid control in his posture. He saw the faint warmth of the suppressor patch, a tiny beacon of deceit. Vorlag's words echoed in his mind. A blank slate for you to imprint upon. The arrogance was breathtaking. They had not offered a person. They had offered a vessel, assuming he would be eager to fill it with his own ego, his own desires. They thought him a simple barbarian, a creature of appetite. He crossed the room and stopped before the Omega, close enough to see the faint, almost invisible flutter of his eyelashes. The boy's scent, even suppressed, was a complex thing, the faint hint of stone after rain, a melancholic counterpoint to the sweet jasmine. It was a scent that hinted at a depth the Ethelgard engineers had failed to entirely scrub away. Kalen felt a flicker of something that wasn't disgust or anger. It was curiosity, a strategist's curiosity. To understand a system, you had to understand its products. To truly conquer Ethelgard, he had to understand the thing it was willing to sacrifice. "You have a name," Kalen stated. It was not a question. The Omega's response was immediate, his voice a soft, toneless murmur. "My designation is Unit 734. "That is not a name. It is a serial number," Kalen countered, his voice hard. "Names have meaning. They are given, not assigned. What is your name?" There was a pause, a fractional delay that spoke of 1,000 hours of conditioning battling a single, direct command. The boy's lips parted, then closed. Kalen saw a flicker of conflict in the depths of his downcast eyes. It was like watching a machine glitch, a ghost in the code. "I am not permitted a name," the Omega finally whispered. The words were hollow, a recitation of fact. "Here, you are permitted what I permit," Kalen said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am permitting you a name." He watched the boy's internal struggle, the subtle war being waged behind a placid mask. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a prisoner, locked inside his own skull. And Kalen, the conqueror, the man who broke fleets and toppled governments, found himself facing a new kind of challenge. Not to break a city, but to break a cage. He made a decision. It was rash, illogical, and went against every military instinct he possessed. It was, perhaps, the first truly unpredictable thing he had done since the war began. "We will start there," he said, more to himself than to the Omega. "We will find your name." The quarters were a study in grey. The walls were grey, the floor was grey, the simple cot with its coarse wool blanket was a darker shade of grey. It was a world devoid of the soft creams and pearlescent whites of Elian's former existence. There was no art, no holographic emitters cycling through soothing landscapes, no ambient music to regulate his mood. There was only the low hum of the station's life support and the stark, functional silence of a warrior's temporary home. Elian stood where he had been left for what felt like hours, a pale figure in a monochrome landscape. His body ached with the strain of maintaining his prescribed posture. But the conditioning was relentless. Movement without purpose was a flaw. The alpha, Kalen, had left him there, alone in the echoing quiet. He had not been touched, not commanded, not even truly acknowledged after that strange, unsettling conversation about a name. Elian's mind, a finely tuned instrument designed to anticipate and fulfill the desires of an alpha, was adrift. There was no data to process, no desire to intuit. The absence of expectation was a vacuum, and it was terrifying. He was a tool without a task, a key for a lock that did not seem to exist. The confusion was a low-grade fever, making his thoughts feel sluggish and strange. When Kalen returned, he carried a stack of data slates. He placed them on the metal desk with a clatter that made Elian's shoulders tense. "Organize these," the Alpha said, his back to him, "by date, oldest to newest." Elian blinked. It was a command, a task. A wave of profound relief washed through him, so potent it was almost dizzying. He finally had a purpose. He moved toward the desk, his steps silent and precise. The slates were cool and heavy, filled with Vargan military reports, logistical data, and historical summaries. The script was angular, efficient, completely alien. He found the date markers, a numerical system he could decipher, and began his work. He sorted the slates into neat piles on the floor, his movements economical and graceful. He was good at this, at order, at following instructions. It was a comfort, a return to the familiar rhythms of his training. But as he worked, a strange dissonance began to creep in. The slates were not perfectly uniform. Some were older, their edges worn smooth. Others were newer, the light from their screens sharper. The dating system had inconsistencies, shifts in formatting that suggested a long history of evolution, not a single top-down design. He was supposed to create perfect order, but the materials themselves were imperfect. His programming demanded a simple, linear solution, but the data resisted. He found himself making small decisions. Should this slate, with its corrupted date file but contextual clues suggesting an earlier period, go here or there? It was a minuscule act of agency, but it felt like a transgression, a knot of frustration, an emotion he had been trained to view as a critical failure, tightened in his chest. He did not realize he had stopped working until Kalen's voice cut through his concentration. "A problem?" Elian looked up, startled. He had forgotten the Alpha was even in the room. Kalen was sitting on the edge of the cot, watching him. His gaze was not predatory or demanding. It was analytical. He felt his cheeks grow warm, a flush of shame. He had failed the simple task. "The chronological data is inconsistent, Lord Alpha," he reported, his voice tight. "Some files are corrupted. My sorting parameters are insufficient." Kalen grunted. "It's a history of 1,000 warring clans coming together, not a report from a central committee. It's messy, like life." He stood and walked over, crouching down to look at the slates Elian had been struggling with. The scent of pine and iron was stronger now, clean and sharp. It didn't feel threatening, merely present. "So what do you do when the parameters are insufficient?" Elian stared at him. The question made no sense. If the parameters were insufficient, the task could not be completed to specification. It was a failure. I would report the failure and await new parameters, Lord Alpha." "There are no new parameters," Kalen said simply. "There is only the task, and your judgment." He tapped a slate with his finger. "Use it. Judgment." The word hung in the air between them, alien and heavy. Judgment was for alphas, for administrators, for those who commanded. His function was to execute, not to judge. He looked from the slate to Kalen's impassive face. The Alpha was not angry. He was waiting. It was a test, Elian realized, but not the kind he was used to. It wasn't a test of his compliance or his perfection. It was a test of something he wasn't sure he possessed. He felt a tremor in his hands and quickly clasped them behind his back. The silence stretched, and in that silence, Elian felt the first true crack appear in the monolithic structure of his conditioning. The foundation of his world was built on the certainty of his function, and the conqueror, the barbarian Alpha, who was supposed to be his master, was asking him to do the one thing he was expressly forbidden to do, to think. He stayed like that for a long time, frozen between the absolute certainty of his past and the terrifying ambiguity of his present. Kalen did not speak again. He simply returned to his cot and began cleaning a sidearm, the methodical, repetitive sounds of metal sliding against metal filling the room. He was giving Elian space. He was giving him time. The gift of time was something Elian had never been given before. His life had been a series of scheduled events, a perfectly calibrated timeline leading to this single point. Now, time was stretching out before him, a vast, grey, empty landscape, and he had been given a broken compass and told to find his own way. The fear was immense, but beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of something else began to stir. It was not frustration. It was not confusion. It was curiosity, a terrifying, exhilarating curiosity to see what would happen if he took a single, unauthorized step. His gaze fell back to the disordered slates on the floor. He slowly, deliberately, reached for one. Kalen watched the Omega from the corner of his eye, his hands moving with practiced ease as he disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled his pulse pistol. The rhythmic clicks and slides of the process were a meditative balm to his frayed nerves. He had spent the day in endless, circular negotiations with the Aethelgard Council, a group of effete, men and women who spoke in metaphors and veiled threats, their primary concern being the preservation of their cultural artifacts over the welfare of their own people. It was exhausting. Returning to his quarters and finding the Omega still wrestling with the simple task he'd been given was strangely a relief. It was a real problem, a tangible knot to be untangled, unlike the smoke and mirrors of Aethelgard politics. He had seen the flicker of panic in the Omega's eyes when he'd questioned him. He'd seen the war between programming and a nascent, struggling intellect. The boy, he needed to stop thinking of him as the Omega, was like a bird born in a cage so small it didn't know it had wings. Every instinct Kalen possessed told him this was a foolish endeavor. The boy was a security risk, a political liability. Lena's warnings echoed in his mind, but his gut, the instinct that had carried him through a dozen campaigns and saved his life more times than he could count, told him something else. It told him that breaking this one individual was a more profound victory than shattering an enemy fleet. It was a refutation of everything the Aethelgard Compact stood for. He watched the boy finally reach for a slate, his movements hesitant, then more certain as he began to create his own system of organization, cross-referencing contextual data to place the corrupted files. He was intelligent. Of course he was. The Aethelgard geneticists were nothing if not thorough. They had simply shackled that intelligence to a set of brutally restrictive protocols. Now, with those protocols proving useless, the intelligence was beginning to carve its own path. Kalen felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He finished with his weapon and stood, his stomach reminding him that he had missed the evening meal rotation. He walked over to the small nutrient dispenser in the wall, a standard military-grade unit, and keyed in a sequence. A tray slid out, containing a block of protein paste, a ration of dried fruit, and a bulb of water. Standard Vagan field rations. It was bland, efficient, and utterly without artifice. He took the tray and, on impulse, walked not to his desk, but to where the Omega was working. He set the tray down on a clear patch of floor. The boy froze, his hand hovering over a slate. He stared at the food as if it were a venomous creature. "Lord Alpha," he whispered, his voice laced with confusion. "You haven't eaten," Kalen said. It was a statement of fact. "My nutrient schedule is managed by the administrator's office. I am not scheduled for sustenance until the next cycle." Kalen felt a surge of cold fury. They even controlled when he was allowed to feel hunger. "The administrator's office no longer has jurisdiction here. I do. And I say, you eat." He nudged the tray closer with the toe of his boot. "Eat." The boy flinched at the sharp command, the old conditioning kicking in. He reached for the protein block with a trembling hand, his movements becoming stiff and mechanical again. He brought it to his lips and took a small, precise bite. He chewed with a detached, clinical motion, his eyes still downcast. He looked like an automaton performing a function. Kalen's frustration mounted. He was getting nowhere. The programming was a fortress. "Stop," he said. The boy froze, the protein block halfway to his mouth. "What was your designation?" Kalen asked, his voice deliberately soft, changing tactics. "Unit 734, Lord Alpha." The response was instant, reflexive. "No," Kalen said, crouching down so he was closer to the boy's level. The scent of suppressed jasmine and rain was stronger here, a melancholy fragrance. "I heard the administrator. That is your designation. I asked for your name." He held the boy's gaze, willing him to look up. "Before they made you Unit 734, before the training and the suppressors and the polished floors, you were born. Someone held you. Someone gave you a name." The boy's eyes, a startlingly clear shade of grey like a winter sky, finally lifted to meet his. Kalen saw a universe of confusion and fear in them. He saw the flicker of something deeper, a memory trying to surface from beneath a crushing weight of indoctrination. The boy's lips parted, and for a moment, no sound came out. It was as if the word was a foreign object in his mouth. "Elian," he finally whispered. The name was a ghost of a sound, fragile and uncertain. It was the most human thing Kalen had heard in this entire God's-forsaken station. The name settled in the space between them. Elian. It felt solid. It felt real. It was a stark contrast to the hollow shell of Unit 734. Kalen felt a shift inside him. The political liability, the symbol, the problem. It was coalescing into a person named Elian. "Elian," Kalen repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It fit. Good. He stood up, the moment of connection broken, but not gone. He knew what he had to do next. It was cruel. It was necessary. "Finish your meal, Elian. Then we are going to get rid of that." He gestured to the suppressor patch on Elian's neck. "I want to meet the person they tried so hard to bury, not the ghost they put on display." The fear that bloomed in Elian's eyes was stark and immediate, but Kalen did not relent. The fortress had to fall, and he was about to light the fuse. The command hung in the air, a death sentence. "We are going to get rid of that." Elian's hand flew to his neck, his fingers brushing against the smooth, bio-integrated surface of the suppressor patch. It was a part of him. It had been implanted when he was a child, a tiny regulator that governed the very essence of his being. It kept his scent muted, his emotions level, his omega nature a placid, manageable thing. To remove it was unthinkable. It was a violation of his core programming, a fundamental corruption of his purpose. His training manuals had dedicated entire chapters to the horrors of an unregulated omega, emotional instability, pheromonal contamination, the destructive chaos of a heat cycle. An unregulated omega was a flaw, a monster, a failure. Lord Alpha, I cannot, he stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush, a crack in his carefully polished composure. My systems are calibrated to the suppressor. Its removal would cause systemic distress. I am designed to be a blank slate, Kalen finished for him, his voice devoid of sympathy. I know, and I told you, I have no use for one. He crossed to the small medical kit mounted on the wall and removed a dermal release tool. It was a simple, brutal-looking Vargan instrument, designed for field medicine, not delicate bio-integration. This will be unpleasant, he said, his tone matter-of-fact, but it will be quick. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Elian. It was an emotion so pure and powerful it bypassed his conditioning entirely. He scrambled backward, away from the approaching Alpha, crab-walking over the scattered data slates until his back hit the cold metal wall. No, he breathed, the word torn from him. Please. He was begging. He who had been trained to have no needs, no desires, was begging. The realization was as terrifying as the tool in Kalen's hand. Kalen stopped, his expression unreadable. He looked at the tool, then at Elian's terrified face. For a moment, Elian thought he saw a flicker of hesitation, of pity, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same unyielding resolve. Fear is a logical response, Elian, the Alpha said, his voice calm, which only amplified Elian's terror. Your entire existence has been a carefully controlled environment. This is the unknown. But you cannot live your life as a ghost. The thing they buried is still in there. I intend to meet it. He moved with a sudden, startling speed. Before Elian could react, Kalen was kneeling in front of him, one hand gently but immovably gripping his chin, tilting his head to the side. The other hand brought the dermal release tool to his neck. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, his body rigid with anticipated pain. He felt the cold metal press against his skin, a sharp, stinging sensation, and then a deep, sickening pull as the tool disengaged the patch's bio-anchors. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and then it was off. For a single, silent moment, nothing happened. And then the floodgates broke. It was like a dam bursting inside him. A lifetime of suppressed pheromones, of muted emotions surged to the surface. His own scent, raw and unfiltered, erupted into the room. It was not the delicate whisper of jasmine and rain. It was a storm. The rain was a deluge. The stone was the sharp, mineral scent of shattered rock. And the jasmine was a wild, heady, almost overwhelmingly sweet bloom, laced with the bitter almond tang of pure, undiluted fear. It was too much. It was too loud. He choked on the sheer volume of his own scent, his own self. The sensory overload was absolute. The grey walls of the room seemed to pulse with a nauseating rhythm. The low hum of the life support became a deafening roar. Kalen's scent, the steady anchor of pine and iron, was now an oppressive mountain, threatening to crush him. Every nerve ending screamed. Emotions, alien and monstrous, crashed through him. Fear, white-hot and blinding. Humiliation, a cold, oily slick. And beneath it all, a deep, resonant grief for a self he never knew he had lost. He curled into a ball, pressing his face into his knees, his hands clamped over his ears as if he could block out the internal chaos. A low, wounded sound escaped his throat, half sob, half keening cry. He was broken. He was contaminated. He was a failure. Through the roaring in his ears, he felt a presence. Kalen had not moved away. He was still there, a solid mass in the swirling chaos of Elian's senses. He expected a blow, a word of disgust, the sharp command to bring himself under control. He was an Omega in distress, his pheromones screaming his instability. Any alpha would react with dominance, would force him into submission to quell the chaotic output. It was instinct. It was biology. But Kalen did not. He simply remained, a silent, unmoving pillar in the storm. He did not release his own dominant pheromones to crush Elian's. He did not speak. He just endured. He sat there, in the thick, cloying cloud of Elian's panic, and breathed. Elian could feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of the alpha's chest. It was a slow, deliberate tempo in the frantic percussion of his own heart. He was weathering Elian's storm. He wasn't trying to stop it. He was letting it happen. The realization was a tiny pinprick of light in the overwhelming darkness. The alpha was not disgusted. He was not angry. He was waiting. He was giving him permission to fall apart. No one had ever given him permission to be anything but perfect. The storm of panic did not cease, but its frantic, destructive edge began to soften. The terror remained, but it was joined by a new, fragile sensation, a profound and deeply unsettling sense of being seen. Not as an asset, not as a gift, but as a person in pain. And the alpha who held his entire world in his hands was choosing, for some unknowable reason, to simply bear witness. The storm receded slowly, leaving Elian adrift on a sea of exhaustion. He was hollowed out, scoured clean. The roaring in his head subsided to a dull hum, and the overwhelming sense settled into a thick, palpable atmosphere in the small room. He was still curled in a tight ball, trembling, but the violent shudders had eased. He felt drained, fragile, like a newborn creature exposed to the world for the first time. He was acutely aware of Kalen's presence, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the steady, grounding scent of pine and iron that had been his only anchor. The alpha had not moved. He had remained a silent sentinel throughout the entire ordeal, his stillness a stark contrast to Elian's violent unraveling. Finally, Kalen shifted. Elian flinched, expecting the spell to be broken, for the judgment to finally come. Instead, a heavy wool blanket was draped over his shaking shoulders. It was the one from the cot, coarse and smelling faintly of the alpha, a scent that was now deeply imprinted on Elian's newly awakened senses. "Breathe," Kalen said, his voice low and rough, but stripped of its earlier command. It was just a suggestion, an instruction for a body that had forgotten how. Elian obeyed, dragging in a ragged breath. The air was thick with his own unfiltered scent, the sharp mineral tang, the heady jasmine, the lingering sour note of fear. He felt a fresh wave of shame. It was indecent to be so exposed. "It will take time for you to acclimate," Kalen continued, his tone clinical, as if he were diagnosing a faulty piece of equipment. "Your body has been running on a closed system. Now it's open to the environment. Everything will feel loud." Elian nodded mutely, pulling the rough blanket tighter around himself. It was a shield against the world, against the alpha's analytical gaze. He felt stripped bare, his every secret emotion now a scent in the air for anyone to read. Kalen seemed to understand. He stood up, putting distance between them, and walked back to his desk. The subtle shift in proximity allowed Elian a sliver of space to breathe. "What you're feeling is not a flaw," Kalen said, his back to Elian as he sorted through a pile of data slates. "It's a natural state. The Ethelgard engineers perverted it, suppressed it. They tried to turn a person into a machine. Machines don't feel fear. People do. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a person." The Alpha's words from the presentation chamber echoed in his mind, but this time they carried a different weight. Before, they had been a source of confusion. Now, they were a lifeline. Kalen was not trying to fix him. He was trying to free him. The motive was still a mystery, a complex equation Elian could not solve. But the action was undeniable. Later, as a fragile calm settled, Kalen spoke to his second-in-command, Lena, over his private comm unit. Elian, huddled on the floor under the blanket, pretended to be asleep, but he listened to every word, his senses now painfully acute. "He is unstable, Lord Alpha," Lena's voice crackled, tight with concern. "My sensor sweeps of your quarters show pheromone levels that are alarming. It's the prelude to a full-blown, distress-induced heat. It could be dangerous, for you and for him." "He is not unstable, Lena. He is uncaged," Kalen corrected her. "And I am not in danger. I am an alpha of the Vargan hegemony, not some pampered Ethelgard aristocrat ruled by his instincts. I can handle the scent of fear without losing my mind. And him, he has no training, no preparation for this. His own biology will be a torment to him. It's cruel." There was a long pause. "War is cruel," Kalen said, his voice flat. "Enslavement is cruel. What they did to him, hollowing him out and offering him up like a piece of meat, was cruel. This is medicine. It may be bitter, but it is necessary." He paused again. He needs context. He needs to understand what was done to him and what a life outside that cage looks like. Grant him access, Level 3 clearance, the Vargan historical archives, all of it, the clan wars, the unification, the first principles. Let him see how we live. Let him see how a person earns their place, rather than having it assigned at birth. Lord Alpha, giving a potential enemy asset access to our historical and philosophical records is a security risk, Lena protested. "He is not an asset," Kalen said, and the finality in his tone was absolute. "He is a refugee, and I am his ward, that is all. Do it, Lena." The comm line went dead. Elian remained perfectly still, the Alpha's words echoing in the quiet room. "He is a refugee, and I am his ward." The terms were clinical, political, devoid of the possessive language of an Alpha to an Omega. Kalen was not claiming him, he was protecting him, and he was giving him a weapon. Not a gun or a blade, but something far more potent. Knowledge. The conqueror, the destroyer of his world, was offering him the story of another one. Elian did not understand why. He could not fathom the strategy behind it. But as he sat there, wrapped in the scent of his own chaotic, terrifying freedom, he knew one thing for certain. The path laid out for him had been obliterated, and for the first time, the blank, grey landscape of the future held not just terror, but the faintest, most fragile glimmer of possibility. The archives were a torrent. Elian sat on the floor of Kalen's quarters, a holographic data slate hovering before him, its cool blue light painting his face in stark relief. For days, he did nothing but consume the information Kalen had granted him access to. He slept in brief, restless bursts, huddled under the wool blanket that had become his sanctuary, and woke to immerse himself again in the brutal, vibrant history of the Vagan hegemony. It was nothing like the curated, sterile histories of Aethelgard, which read like philosophical treatises on the perfection of their society. The Vagan archives were raw, contradictory, and deeply, violently human. He read of the thousand-year clan wars, a history written in blood and iron on a dozen different worlds. He saw images of rugged landscapes, of cities built in canyons and under harsh, alien suns. He learned of their first principles, a code that valued personal honor, earned strength, and communal responsibility above all else. Status was not inherited or assigned. It was won through trials of combat, of intellect, of leadership. An alpha was not a ruler by birthright, but a leader who had proven their ability to protect their clan. An omega was not a decorative object or a breeding vessel, but an integral part of the community, valued for their skills as healers, arbiters, and lawkeepers, their heightened empathy seen as a strength, not a weakness to be suppressed. The contrast was a physical shock. In Aethelgard, his purpose had been to be beautiful and silent. His value was in his pliability. Here, in this culture of warriors and survivors, value was in utility, in resilience, in the will to not just survive, but to strive. He was a creature of a world that had tried to engineer out the very qualities the Vagans prized most. As he delved deeper, his own memories began to surface, sharp and painful fragments breaking through the placid surface of his conditioning. He saw the white, sterile room of his upbringing. He saw the face of Administrator Vorlag, calm and impassive, his voice a soft, chilling monotone. Emotion is a flaw, Unit 734. It creates unpredictability. Your function is to be a predictable, stable asset, a tool of diplomacy. He remembered the physical training, hours spent holding painful, elegant poses. He remembered the lessons, the endless recitation of protocols for pleasing an alpha. He remembered the other omegas, pale and silent like him, some of whom had disappeared after displaying a flicker of rebellion or emotional contamination. They were not reassigned. They were decommissioned. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, washed over him. He was not a gift. He was a survivor, the last one standing in a quiet, bloodless culling. He looked up from the slate and caught his reflection in the darkened screen of the main terminal across the room. He saw a pale, thin figure, his eyes wide and haunted in the blue light. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was a mess. His scent, which he was slowly learning to live with, filled the room with a complex, melancholic fragrance of rain and jasmine, now tinged with the sharp ozone of dawning anger. The anger was a new sensation, a slow, hot burn in his chest. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. It was his. He stood up, his legs stiff, and walked to the terminal. He stared at his reflection. He saw the graceful, pliant posture that had been drilled into him, the slight, deferential tilt of his head. It was the posture of a victim, the posture of an object. He thought of the images he had seen in the archives, the Vagan warriors, men and women, alphas, betas, and omegas, stood with their feet planted firmly, their spines straight, their gazes direct. They took up space. They owned the ground they stood on. Slowly, deliberately, Elian straightened his spine. He lifted his chin. He met his own gaze in the dark screen. He planted his feet slightly apart, mimicking the stance he had seen in 100 images of Kalans, people. The change was small, but it felt monumental. It sent a tremor of defiance through him. He wasn't Unit 734. He was not a tool. He was Elian. and he was angry. Kalen entered the room silently, and for the first time, Alien did not flinch or lower his gaze. He remained as he was, watching the Alpha's reflection join his own in the screen. Kalen stopped, his expression unreadable. He took in Alien's new posture, the unfamiliar spark of defiance in his eyes. He took in the scent in the room, the anger that now mingled with the fear and the grief. "You've been busy," Kalen observed, his voice neutral. "Your history is illuminating," Alien replied, and was surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. It was still soft, but the toneless, mechanical quality was gone. "And?" Kalen prompted. Alien turned from the screen to face him directly. He held the Alpha's gaze. "I have come to a conclusion, Lord Alpha. And that is?" "That my creators were not just wrong," Alien said, the words precise, cold, and burning with a fire he had never known he possessed. "They were weak. Their system, their perfection, it is a monument to their fear. Fear of chaos, fear of strength, fear of life itself. And they tried to build me in that image." He took a breath, the scent of his own conviction rising in the air. "You did not conquer a great civilization, Lord Alpha. You toppled a gilded cage full of frightened people who had forgotten how to fight, and you were given me, their most perfect, most frightened creation, as a reward." The bitterness in his own voice was a shock, but he did not back down. He stood his ground, his new Vargan stance holding firm. "I am the embodiment of their weakness, and I will not be that anymore." A slow, almost imperceptible change occurred in Kalen's expression. The analytical coolness in his eyes warmed with something that looked like approval, or perhaps respect. "Good," he said, the single word resonating with profound significance. "That is a good place to start." The shift in Alien was not lost on the Vargan crew. His presence in the Alpha's quarters had transitioned from being a symbol of the enemy's decadence to a disquieting mystery. Whispers followed Kalen in the corridors. His rival, a hardline Alpha named Jorik, whose clan had always chafed under Kalen's unified command, saw an opportunity. Jorik was a traditionalist, a believer in the old ways, where strength was measured only in combat, and diplomacy was a tool of the weak. He saw Kalen's unorthodox handling of the Omega as a sign of corruption, a softening of the Vargan steel that had won them the war. Kalen was aware of the dissent. Lena kept him apprised, her reports clipped and laced with concern. "Yorick is rallying support among the fleet captains," she informed him during a private briefing. "He's using the Omega as his centerpiece. He claims you've been tainted by Ethelgard's influence, that keeping the boy is a sign you're adopting their degenerate customs." Kalen stared out the viewport at the glittering superstructure of the Ethelgard station, his hands clasped behind his back. "Yorick is a fool. He sees a battle and mistakes it for the war. The war wasn't just about taking this station. It was about breaking the ideology that built it. Elian is not a symbol of their customs. He is a casualty of them." "Yorick won't see it that way," Lena warned. "He sees an Alpha keeping a pretty Omega in his rooms and draws the simplest conclusion. He's going to challenge you. Not for the hegemony, not yet, but for your command of this fleet. He'll frame it as a vote of no confidence." "Let him," Kalen said, his voice a low growl. "Let him bring his grievances out of the shadows and into the light. It's better to lance the boil than let the infection fester." He turned from the viewport, his eyes hard. "Yorick's mistake is that he still thinks of Elian as an object, a prize. He has no idea what he's dealing with." The challenge came 2 days later, as Kalen had predicted. It was not a formal duel, but a public confrontation in the station's primary command center. Yorick, a bull of a man with a scent of scorched earth and hot metal, strode into the center of the room, flanked by two of his most loyal captains. Kalen was reviewing tactical displays with his command staff. Elian was there, standing silently by a secondary console, ostensibly organizing stellar cartography data, but in reality, observing, learning, absorbing the rhythms of a Vargan command crew. He wore a simple, grey Vargan tunic now, the cream-coloured silks of Ethelgard long since discarded. "Kalen," Yorick boomed, his voice echoing in the large chamber. All activity ceased. Every eye turned to the two alphas. "We need to talk." Kalen turned slowly from the console, his expression calm, almost bored. "We are talking, Yorick, though you seem to be shouting." Yorick's face darkened. "This fleet is growing soft under your command. We conquered this station to impose our strength, not to be seduced by its weakness." His gaze flickered to Elian, a look of open contempt on his face. "You keep their pet. You closet yourself with it. The warriors are whispering. They wonder if our Lord Alpha has lost his edge, if he's become another Ethelgard aristocrat, content with his trinkets." Kalen's scent sharpened, the calm pine and iron gaining a cutting edge of ozone. But his voice remained level. "My command is not determined by whispers, Yorick. It is determined by results. This station is secure. The treaty is signed. The hegemony's position is stronger than it has ever been. What, precisely, is your grievance?" "My grievance is that you dishonor us," Yorick roared, taking a step forward. "You parade this thing around as if it has a place here. It is a symbol of everything we fought against, a creature bred for submission, for pleasure. Its presence here is a poison. It weakens you. It weakens us all." "You are mistaken," Kalen said, his voice dropping, becoming more dangerous in its quiet intensity. "You see a pet. I see a survivor. You see weakness. I see a testament to the enemy's own self-destructive cruelty. He is not a poison, Yorick. He is a mirror. And if you don't like the reflection you see in it, perhaps the problem is not with the mirror." Yorick laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A mirror? It is an Omega, Kalen, a creature of instinct and pheromones. Let us prove it." Before anyone could react, Yorick focused his will and released a wave of dominant alpha pheromones directly at Elian. It was a targeted, biological assault, designed to trigger an instinctual, submissive Omega response. It was meant to force Elian to his knees, to make him whimper and avert his gaze, to prove Yorick's point in the most visceral way possible. The air thickened with the scent of hot metal and aggression, a suffocating, terrifying pressure. Kalen tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the sidearm at his hip, but he stopped himself, his eyes locked on Elian. This was not his fight to win. The wave of pheromonal aggression crashed over Elian, a physical force designed to overwhelm his senses and short-circuit his rational thought. It was the biological equivalent of a shout in the face, a brutal command to submit. His training screamed at him to obey, to drop his gaze, to make himself small, to expose his neck. His newly awakened instincts, raw and untutored, flooded him with a paralyzing dose of fear. The scent of scorched earth filled his lungs, choking him, and for a terrifying second, his knees buckled. He was going to fall. He was going to prove Yorick right. He was, and always would be, nothing more than a creature of instinct. But then, another instinct kicked in, not the one programmed by Ethelgard or dictated by his biology, but a new one, forged in the fire of Kalen's quarters, honed by the Vargan archives. The instinct to survive, the instinct to defy. He smelled the scorched metal of Jorik's dominance, and beneath it, he smelled the Alpha's insecurity. He saw the challenge for what it was, a desperate gambit by a man who felt his own power slipping away. The fear did not vanish, but the anger, his new and precious anger, rose to meet it. He straightened his knees, the muscles in his legs screaming with the effort. He lifted his chin, and he met Yorik's furious gaze head-on. The command center was utterly silent. Everyone was watching, waiting for the Omega to break. But he did not break. He stood his ground, a slender grey figure in a room of warriors, and held the furious gaze of the challenging Alpha. The scent of his fear was still in the air, a sharp tang of ozone, but it was now underpinned by something else, something steely and determined. The scent of rain on cold stone. "Your display is impressive, Lord Jorik," Elian said, his voice quiet but carrying with perfect clarity in the tense silence. It did not tremble. A demonstration of profound biological power. It is precisely the sort of tactic the Ethelgard High Command predicted the barbarian Vargans would employ. Yorik's eyes widened slightly in surprise. He had expected whimpering, not analysis. "What did you say, little pet?" "I said that you are behaving exactly as my former masters expected you to," Elian continued, his voice gaining strength. He took a small, deliberate step forward, a shocking act of audacity. They believed the Vargan hegemony was a culture of brute force ruled by instinct, incapable of nuanced strategy. They believed your alphas were little more than animals, easily provoked and easily misled. They created me to be the perfect bait for such an animal. He gestured to himself. Placid, beautiful, a simple prize for a simple mind. By attempting to dominate me, you are not proving your strength. You are validating their failed strategic assessment. You are proving that you are the barbarian they thought you were. A low murmur went through the assembled Vargan officers. They were warriors, but they were not fools. They were the architects of a victory that had relied as much on strategy and discipline as it had on brute force. Elian's words hit their mark. "My presence here is not a sign of Lord Kalen's weakness," Elian pressed on, his confidence growing with every word. "It is a sign of his strength, the strength to see beyond the surface, the strength to recognize a strategic asset where others see only a trophy. I have spent my entire life inside the Ethelgard command structure. I know their protocols, their security codes, their psychological profiles. I know where they were weak, and I know where they might still believe they are strong. Lord Kalen is not keeping me as a pet. He is debriefing a high-value intelligence source." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Tell me, Lord Yorik, in your haste to challenge your alpha, did you ever once consider what tactical value I might represent? Or did you simply see an omega and let your base instincts do the thinking for you?" The accusation was devastating. Elian had taken Yorik's own argument that he was a creature of instinct and turned it back on him with surgical precision. He had used the logic of the Vargans themselves, the primacy of strategy and utility, to dismantle the challenge. Yorik was left speechless, his face a mask of purple fury. He had been outmaneuvered, not by an alpha in a contest of wills, but by the very pet he had sought to humiliate. Kalen watched, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. He had never been more proud. He had planted a seed in the barren ground of Ilian's conditioning, and it had not just sprouted, it had grown into a tree of iron. Yorick, robbed of his argument and humiliated before the command staff, fell back on his most basic instinct. With a roar of pure rage, he lunged, not at Elian, but at Kalen. "You let this thing speak for you. You are no alpha of mine." The fight was brutally short. Kalen met Yorick's charge not with fury, but with cold, economic precision. He sidestepped the clumsy rush, used Yorick's own momentum against him, and in a fluid motion had the larger alpha pinned to the deck with a blade to his throat. The scent of Kalen's dominance flooded the room, no longer just a warning, but an absolute, undeniable statement of power. It was the scent of pine and iron and the cold, final authority of a victor. "The challenge is noted, Yorick," Kalen said, his voice dangerously soft. "And it is ended. You have questioned my command. You have dishonored my guest, and you have proven to everyone in this room that you think with your glands instead of your brain." He pressed the blade just enough to draw a single drop of blood. "You are relieved of your command. Consider yourself fortunate I am leaving you with your life." He stood, pulling his blade back. Yorick lay on the floor, defeated and gasping, the scent of his rage replaced by the sour smell of humiliation. Kalen did not give him a second glance. His gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of every officer, daring any other to challenge him. No one did. Then his eyes found Elian's. Elian was standing tall, his hands no longer trembling. The fear was gone from his scent, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of rain after a lightning strike. In Kalen's gaze, there was no pity, no condescension. There was only a profound, undisguised respect, a look between equals. The physical battle had been Kalen's, but the true victory, the one that had solidified Kalen's command and shattered the last vestiges of Elian's past, had been won with words, and everyone in the room knew it. The command center slowly returned to a state of tense normalcy, the officers moving with a new, sober purpose. Yorick was escorted away by the guard, a disgraced alpha, whose failed power play had only served to cement Kalen's authority. The air, thick moments before with aggression and pheromonal conflict, began to clear, leaving behind the sterile hum of the station and the lingering scent of ozone. Elian remained by the console, his heart still beating, a powerful, steady rhythm against his ribs. He felt solid. The trembling, hollow creature that had arrived on this station felt like a ghost, a memory of someone else. The person standing here now had faced down an alpha and had not broken. Kalen walked over to him, his presence a familiar comfort rather than a threat. The overwhelming dominance he had displayed moments before had receded, leaving behind the calm, grounding scent of pine and iron that Elian had come to associate with safety. "You did well," Kalen said, his voice low enough that only Elian could hear. It was not praise. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the weight of a formal commendation. "I used their own logic against them," Elian replied, his gaze fixed on the swirling star map on the screen before him. "The logic you taught me." "I gave you the information," Kalen corrected him gently. "You forged it into a weapon. There is a difference." He was silent for a moment, watching the subtle play of emotions on Elian's face, now an open book to his newly attuned senses. He could scent the pride, the lingering adrenaline, and beneath it all, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "Come," he said. "You've earned a rest." He led Elian from the command center, away from the prying eyes and whispered conversations. The walk back to Kalen's quarters was silent. They moved in step, a comfortable synchronicity between them that had not existed before. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Elian was no longer a ward, a refugee, or a project. He was an ally. Inside the Spartan grey room that had become Elian's entire world, the silence felt different. It was not the empty, waiting silence of his first days here, nor the tense, analytical silence of his re-education. It was a shared, peaceful quiet. The air was a complex mixture of their scents, Kalen's steady pine and Elian's rain-washed jasmine, no longer a chaotic clash, but a mingling, a harmony. Elian walked to the viewport and looked out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. The Ethel Guard station was a jewel of light and order against the infinite black. From here, it still looked perfect, unconquered. But he knew the truth. He knew the rot at its core, because he was a product of it. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice soft. He was not asking about Yorick or the fleet. He was asking about himself. His purpose as a gift had been voided. His new purpose as an intelligence asset had been proven. But what came after? Kalen came to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. He followed Elian's gaze to the station below. "Now, you have a choice," he said. "Yorick's challenge, and your response to it, has clarified your position. You are no longer a spoil of war. No one in this fleet will see you as such again. You are a free individual under my protection." He turned to face Elian, his expression serious. "I can arrange transport for you, to a neutral system, to one of the Vargan core worlds, if you wish. I will give you the resources to build a new life, wherever you choose. You are not my prisoner. You are not my property. You were never meant to be." The offer was a physical blow. Freedom. True, unconditional freedom. It was everything he should have wanted. The thought of leaving, of starting over on a world where no one knew him, where he was not a symbol of a fallen society, was a dizzying prospect. He could be anonymous. He could be normal. But the thought of leaving this grey room, of leaving the scent of pine and iron, of leaving the side of this complex, brutal, honorable alpha who had dismantled his cage and then handed him the key. It left a hollow ache in his chest. He looked at Kalen, at the hard lines of his face, the intelligence in his eyes, the unexpected gentleness he had shown when Elian had been at his most broken. He had been a gift to the conquering alpha, a thing to be owned, but Kalen had refused the gift. He had demanded the person. "And what if I don't want to leave?" Elian asked, the question a quiet confession. Kalen's gaze softened. "Then you stay. Not as a guest, not as a ward. Your performance in the command center proved your value beyond any doubt. I am creating a new position on my command staff, a civilian advisor, specializing in post-unification strategy and socio-political integration. Your knowledge of Ethelgard is invaluable. Your perspective is unique." He paused, the air charged with unspoken meaning. "The position is yours. If you want it, you would be a member of my council, my equal, his equal." The words resonated deep in Elian's soul, the final, definitive refutation of a lifetime of programming. He was not a gift. He was not a tool. He was not an asset. He could be an equal. A slow smile, the first genuine, unburdened smile of his life, touched Elian's lips. It felt strange and wonderful. "I accept the position," he said, his voice clear and steady. Kalen nodded, a corresponding smile briefly touching his own mouth. He held out his hand. It was not a gesture of dominance or possession. It was the gesture of one warrior to another, a sealing of an oath, a partnership. Elian looked at the offered hand, at the calloused fingers and the strength in the grip. He placed his own hand in it. The contact was warm, solid, real. It was not the claiming touch of a master, but the firm, respectful clasp of a comrade, of a partner. As their hands met, a final piece of the old world fell away. He had been brought here as a symbol of surrender, a beautiful object meant to placate a conqueror. But the conqueror had seen not an object, but a person, and in doing so, had conquered the very system that had created him. Elian looked from their joined hands to Kaelin's face, and he knew he was home. He was not a gift. He was not a prize. He was a reckoning, and his war had just begun.